You know, I'm glad I met you, because now I can forget all about you. My Jesus is much more important and much more powerful. Thank you. It's a good thing I met you.
Hello and welcome once again to the Cine-Files, where we are concluding both, I believe, our season of Scorsese and our exploration of his 1988 film, The Last Temptation of Christ. My name is Steve Morris. I'm a filmmaker and directing instructor in Los Angeles, California.
Hello, everyone. My name is John Rocha. I'm a writer, producer, and host, and voiceover artist here in San Diego, California. And Jesus, we are back with Jesus for one more installment here of the season of Scorsese. Steve, we have made it. Now, I'm not going to compare, because I don't want to get people upset. I'm not going to compare to us carrying the cross, which is what at times what the season of Scorsese has felt like, but it's been at times tough. It's been a lot of weight to carry, and it's been a hard road at times with all the stuff we've had to do, and certainly on your side with all the research you've had to do for these films. But we have gotten here. We have arrived. And when we're done with the episode, maybe we will both say it is accomplished. It is accomplished. So, so I'm looking forward to jumping in. I've really enjoyed our last two parts of discussions. And I've seen our fandom split in some people enjoying the discussions, some people upset that we're even doing the film, some people not liking that we're doing, not liking our points of views. But overall, it's been a very positive reaction. And so you would anticipate that and expect that. And so I imagine that will carry into our last part of this discussion, The Last Temptation of Christ.
Well, I mean, these are to say that these are important stories and big stories and stories with deep, profound meaning for a lot of people is the ultimate understatement.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, in the world of, at least we'll say, Western, quote unquote, Western civilization, there are a few stories more important than what we are talking about today.
100%.
And it's interesting, too, something that has come up many times of people talking about, oh, we like stories because we're surprised.
Yeah.
And that's certainly true sometimes. But sometimes we like going through the same story again and again and again in different ways. And there's something satisfying is the wrong word, because what we're about to see is torture and a tremendous tragedy. But like you go through, okay, now we are about to go meet Pontius Pilate. You know what I mean? As you've done many, many times in various different versions of this story. You know?
There's almost I get what you're getting at. It's a comfort thing. It's a comfort thing, right? We know this story. So therefore I go back to this story because A, I need to hear this story again. Or B, this story brings me comfort, or it wakes me up and reminds me of a lesson that I need to remember. So these are why people rewatch movies. There's a reason why we love doing the show. We rewatch movies. Why? Because we come back to them because they elicit a certain response from us. There's a comfort. There's a nostalgia. There's a intellectually challenging aspect of it all. All multiple reasons and many reasons why we go back to things. I mean, the Lady Outlaw loves to rewatch these British mystery shows from the 1990s it drives me insane because they're so bad. But for her, it's a comfort level. She has it on in the background. She just loves having. So there are certain things these stories represent, these things that we revisit represent. And I do the same thing with sports memories. I can't even tell you how many times I've rewatched big sports moments on YouTube, because for me, I find such a joy in marveling at the artistry of it. And maybe that's another aspect of why we enjoy stories, because we, on a subconscious level, marvel at the artistry of them being able to create such a story that resonates for us and with us.
That last one, particularly for me, I think you just described a huge part that I think that feeling is what part of what the Cine-Files is built on, is 100%. The love of the artistry. And there's, particularly with this story, to me, it's the unknowableness of what this story means, who is the character of Jesus, and how we frame it. And that's why for me, and I know there are people who are definitely offended by this, exploring a different interpretation is exciting for me.
Yes.
And for some people, it can feel blasphemous, which is obviously this film. This is right in the middle of those two feelings, Yeah. But as I said, Jesus has just been arrested, and now we are going to meet Pontius Pilate.
So you are the king of the Jews?
King's your word.
Well, you are Jesus of Nazareth, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
I love the way this scene is done, and just the fact that it's in this space, brightly lit. He's working with his horse. and you see this, I will say, a fascinating for me characterization of the character of Pontius Pilate, played by David Bowie, who I think this is amazing casting for me. What's your feeling about it?
I think it works for the story they're telling, right? That's the you can only judge a film by what story it's telling. And if it's consistent with its theme, it's consistent with its energy, it's consistent with its casting and its portrayals and performances. And I think David Bowie fits in what they're doing. It's a stripped down Pontius Pilate. It's a Pontius Pilate that's very simplistic in answering the questions. And by the way, in the story, in all the interpretations, Pontius is not some evil guy. He is more often than not a person who is put upon to do this thing because this is the law. And he does it because it's the law, and and Jesus is led to this torture and punishment, and it's all being pushed on by the Pharisees and by Rome, and also there's a lot of moving factors. I mean, Pontius is a middleman, and basically he's being told by the people that he is governing, and their religious leaders, and the people above him, that he's got to make an example out of Jesus. And there are not many interpretations of Pontius where he's an overwhelmingly evil guy. It's just that he's a bureaucrat. He's put in this position. Even in Ben-Hur, he's put in this position, and he has to do the things he has to do, right? And so here, the same thing with David Bowie. There's like, you know what I have to do, right? By the end, he's just saying the things that matter-of-factly, but he is trying to give Jesus like a little bit of leeway here. Like, tell me the things you're saying. Perform some miracles for me. What are the things? And they have a philosophical discussion. So I found that to be an interesting scene as well that worked because of how they've constructed the film.
I totally agree in terms of the film, and I just feel compelled to say one thing, which is not about the film, but it is something that I am seeing more in the world today, and even saw on Twitter recently with a friend of mine who reposted a thing about this, and that is, again, I'm not talking about the film here. I'm talking about the thousands of years in which Jews were blamed for the death of Jesus, that Jews killed Jesus. And I would like to say, for the record, at this moment, that is not true. The idea, first of all, Jesus and all of his apostles were Jews.
Yes.
So that doesn't make sense. It's like saying that the blacks killed Malcolm X. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, well, the people that shot him were African American, but that doesn't mean there was a conspiracy on part of this one race to murder this person. That doesn't make sense. And the reason I bring it up is because literally I saw it on Twitter like a week or two ago of someone posting, yeah, well, the Jews did kill Jesus, right? And it's like, no, it's not right. That's not true. Yeah. Certainly there were Jewish people involved in Jesus's death. There were Jewish people who felt that was a tragedy, and the people that actually killed him are the Romans. Regardless of how we feel about Pontius Pilate, the guys who actually executed Jesus were Romans, not Jews. I just feel compelled as a Jewish man in a world of rising anti-Semitism to make that point.
I think you're more than fair to make that point, and you're 100% right.
As far as the scene is concerned, I see it exactly how you do, which is what the way I see that Bowie is playing it. And it's interesting, too, that Scorsese resisted the idea that everyone in the ancient world speaks with British accents. Yeah. But for Pontius, he reinforced that. He brought in the British character to play this part. And I feel like, yeah, he is a member of the bureaucracy who's actually, in his mind, being nice to talk to this person for a few minutes to hear his side of the story, you know?
Yeah. And even at the end, when he throws a little bit of a threat down about the skulls of Golgotha and there's more than 3,000 of them, he says, I wish you all would go up there and count them. I wish you would. Maybe it would change your mind about the things you're doing. So he's almost like, God, I don't like to do this. I don't want to do this, but where I'm at and the position that I have to do this. But then he says, before he walks out, he says, yeah, but maybe it wouldn't, or no, it wouldn't. And so, because he understands the resolve of the Jewish people to fight against Rome, it's the resolve of any occupied peoples to fight against its occupying force. It will never end. It is the absolute cycle of life. If you occupy a land, people who are occupied will fight back. If we were to ever be occupied as a country, we would never rest until we got America back to the way it was, when we were more in charge of our own thing. So it's no surprise, but there's a lot going on with Bowie's delivery of the lines that betrays much more, because it's a simple scene and it's a quick scene, but there's a lot more going on in what he's trying to say here. about the resolve of Jewish people who were taken over there by the Romans.
Well, and I think what you have to say about the idea of the occupied people is so important. And you can look at this around the world, and you could look at this where we have been, people have sided with the occupiers or sided with the occupied.
Yeah.
We in Vietnam or in Afghanistan, we're asking exactly the same questions that Pontius is asking in this scene of like, hey, why do you guys keep doing this? We're here. This isn't going to change. Why do you keep blowing things up or disobeying us? And the answer is exactly what you said. We are occupying their country, but the occupiers don't see it that way. And I'm not going to apply this all the places we could apply it to our world right now, but those are certainly things that are definitely true. I love the moment, by the way. And first, much as we've seen in other scenes with Pontius and Jesus, that he won't accept the title of King of the Jews, even though that's a title we've heard mentioned around him before.
Yeah.
And then he asks for magic, which Jesus is like, I'm not a performer.
All right. Tell me what you tell people on the streets.
The prophet Daniel had a vision. A tall statue had a gold head and silver shoulders. The stomach was bronze, the legs were iron, the feet were clay. A stone was thrown. The clay feet broke and the statue collapsed.
And I love that he starts to then give the interpretation of this, which remember earlier when at the what was the Scorsese version of the Sermon on the Mount, he told his story about the seeds and everyone looked at him with blank stares. And then he started to explain, hey, this is what this means. Right. So he expects blank stares from Pontius and starts to explain.
You see, God threw the stone. The stone's me. And Rome
is the statue.
Yes.
What I love about that moment is that Pontius is the educated person who is way, in his mind, is way ahead of this guy. Like, I get what you're doing. I've seen guys like you before. I'll see guys like you after this. I'm actually trying to throw you, a chance here that you're not taking advantage of.
Right. You're just another Jewish politician.
Yeah.
Right.
Just another Jewish politician. And then there's this moment that you mentioned before of his hope that maybe they would take a lesson, but probably not.
And I wonder if this is a bit of a subtle jab by Scorsese about, the intellectual and how they view religion. Like, because he just sees Jesus as yet another prophet, another Jewish politician. And maybe by having Pontius be this person who's way ahead of all these, of someone like Jesus, because he's seen so many come before, his lack of belief in Jesus is all the more evident in how he's doing the things that he's doing, because he needs to see something extra for him to really believe this is real. And the fact that he doesn't makes him miss the fact that Jesus is who he is. So he relies on his educated point of view. And there's a lot of people on the religious side who would say educated people don't, or find the reason not to believe in religion, find the reason not to believe in God. And I would imagine 9 times out of 10, the people who are atheists because they are educated and see through the story and don't necessarily well, I guess I shouldn't say 9 times out of 10. My feeling is that people who are atheists, and I'm sure you can speak to this, Steve, are because they don't sense that it's the truth. And because of their education and their point of view and their knowledge, they can poke holes in it and see and go back and study the history of how the story of Jesus is connected to pagan stories and other these things in the past, and find the reasoning with which to not believe in it, which, I can absolutely understand.
As you know, I've spent a lot of time thinking about atheism and religion, and this has been an obsession of mine for decades. And I think you are 100% right. I completely agree with you. I think that what tends to happen, this is my analysis of how I think this happens, is that people have a feeling that is deeply held about how the world works. Mm-hmm. And then they use their intellect and education to prove that the feeling that they already had innately is true, rather than the other way around. And I'm not saying it doesn't happen the other way around. I'm not saying that one can't be raised logically in an atheist environment and then discover religion and then feel, and through research come to the conclusion that that's true. I think that can happen that way. But I think it's much more likely, and this is true in general, in politics and everything else, we tend to use our brain to convince us that the thing that we already wanted was right.
Yeah.
Rather than the other way around. The one other thing I would say, though, is I think, and now I'll say the atheist point of view, which is that it is perfectly reasonable based on what we know of the historical record to go that, oh, it was the apostles and the gospels and Saul who became Paul afterward who made up a bunch of stuff because that wasn't in the historical record. And what Pontius thinks about this guy, you're just another Jewish politician. It's perfectly reasonable for an atheist to go, that seems like the truth. This was just another Jewish politician that a bunch of people made up a bunch of stories about afterward in order to prove that this was the Messiah.
Yeah. This is what we're going to talk about today, and we've already started to talk about. This is the most important section of the movie. The last 43 minutes of the film, or 40 minutes, I guess, with credits, but like this last 40 minutes of the film are the most important section of the film. Everything is laying the groundwork for what we're going to see in these 40 minutes.
Well, and the next moment is just this moment of tremendous torture, which is that Jesus, now naked, essentially in a hard cut from Pontius, is kicked in the balls and then mercilessly beaten. And I just have to say, Willem Dafoe, this is not easy. To be naked all day on a movie set in a cold space on stone floors, getting beaten up.
Yeah.
I mean, we talk about today, there's so much more sensitivity in terms of sexuality on screen and how to be respectful of the actor and all of this. Being tortured naked in front of a movie crew all day, that's just hard. That's a lot to go through. I don't know that I would be capable of being that actor, you know?
But yes, this is true, Stephen. And watching this happen, look, and I couldn't help but think of the Passion of the Christ, obviously, because it's much, much more brutal in the Passion of the Christ. What Gibson puts Caviezel through in the scene. But I think again that this is the smart move for this movie. It's a stripped down movie. This isn't about sensationalizing anything, because the violence is so spare and so sparse in this sequence. It makes it all the more chilling and unsettling. I caught myself looking away a couple of times through this whole sequence because the violence isn't just whipping, as you said, it's also kind of modern in the kicking of the balls and then the punching in the face. And remember, guys, nothing is on screen, in frame without a reason. As the camera moves to the right, we see a person who is completely indifferent, just sitting there as Jesus is getting absolutely brutally beat up. And there's a reason for that. This casual violence, this casual approach to violence, torture, pain, this thing that there are people who exist in a world where that's just so happenstance, it's not a big deal to them. And it's the, what do you call it? The desensitizing of violence. So that person is just sitting there as the camera moves past because they could care less. And then we see the whipping of Jesus. And to me, I think this is an interesting thing when you remember at the beginning of the movie about how he talks about how he whipped himself and beat himself. So in a way, we're going all the way back to the beginning of the film. He's essentially been prepping his body for this. He's been prepping without knowing. He's been prepping his body and mind for this experience because he's already done it to himself. And so there's a preparation and a strength here. And when they put the crown on, there's not a lot of yelling. There's not a lot of yelping or squealing or crying for peace or mercy. He just takes it, and you hear him scream at certain moments out in pain, but like he takes it. When they put the crown of thorns on his head, the blood that trickles down, I think, is really powerful. And then when we see his face, that is what you've led to in this whole sequence, and it is devastating and heartbreaking.
So first of all, I think just on an aesthetic level, the design of this particular crown of thorns, is the most powerful and stunning of any that I can think of in film. I think it looks, because and it's so much referencing, you know, the Renaissance paintings, that this sort of, you know, that idea of the aesthetics of the crucifixion. I just, based on what you were saying, I just had kind of a full epiphany that I'm going to try to put together here in real time, which is back in our conversation about religion, I brought up that for me, if I were Jesus, I would rather be remembered for the things that I said rather than the way that I died. And then I just connected, and that's just sort of what draws me to Jesus are the philosophical ideas, the things that he said. That's what's important to me. But then I just remembered when the executive at Paramount asked Martin Scorsese, why do you want to make this film? His answer was, because I want to get to know Jesus better. And I was like, oh, that's a really interesting answer. But then when you think about the Passion of the Christ, it's really based on, you know, the medieval passion plays, and that we would show the crucifixion of Jesus, and the idea of like, this is what Jesus did for me.
Yeah.
It was his suffering that saved my soul, that saved my life. That's the most important thing. And now I go back to this film, is that clearly Scorsese is making the film that he wanted to make, which is he's not like me, fascinated by the things that Jesus said. And he's not like Mel Gibson, fascinated by the way that Jesus died and how his sacrifice saved the world.
Yeah.
He is interested in who is Jesus.
Yeah.
That's what he's interested in. And that's why. And so all of these choices are the outcropping of that basic question that he started with in 1983 when he was developing the film at Paramount.
Yeah. Yeah.
We see him out in the crowd, and all the shots are fairly stunning. We do have the moment where Peter denies Jesus, which might be even the wimpiest of all those Peter moments. Even though Peter is always wimpy in this moment, this one in particular is weak. Particularly the way he takes off and runs and bumps into another disciple who's also running away from Jesus.
Yeah.
There's an incredible top-down shot of him carrying the cross, and then this slow motion, long lens shot of him carrying the cross through the crowd. It's on screen for a long time. It's based on a Hieronymus Bosch painting. It is totally stunning and powerful. And by the way, the prop company built a heavy version of the cross and a lighter version of the cross so that Willem Dafoe could choose. And if he had to have it for a long time, he could take the lighter version. But if he had to lift it up off the ground, then you would want the heavier version so that the physical action would match more readily.
That makes sense.
Willem Dafoe only used the heavy cross.
Oh, actors.
I bet you would too.
100%. 100% I will use the heavy version. Of course. You've got to feel it.
We arrive at Golgotha. Initially, the crucifixion was supposed to be a 3-day shoot with 85 shots. But they were out of time and out of budget. And so it became a 2-day shoot with 55 shots.
55 shots in 2 days. Good God.
I mean, that's not, it depends. Of course, it always depends on the shots. Like knocking out 30 shots in a day is not terribly unreasonable if they are a 2-shot, an over the shoulder, a close up, and a bunch of inserts.
Right.
But,
it's like there's a lot here. Yeah.
But yeah, if you're nailing someone to the cross and the camera is moving, you got lots of extras, you got lots of people, it's hard. You got to knock stuff out.
Blood squirting. Yeah. You got to make sure it all works. Yeah.
Yeah. And we see Mary Magdalene and Martha and the other Mary there. Jesus is climbing up the hill. There's a moment where he asks,
Mother Magdalene, where are you?
And then he sees them and they kneel. And I've always been struck in this story, and you probably have too, that Peter and the other apostles, they run away.
Yeah.
And the women are there.
Yeah. I think it was only John in the canon gospel who was there with Mary and Magdalene when Jesus was crucified.
There is the moment of the hammer.
Yeah.
And I think this has been set up so beautifully by that moment that you commented on, where Jesus is there and the blood goes into his face. And we had the guy who, is repeating the same words over and over again, and that it gets driven into his wrist. And now we're here with Jesus having to experience the same thing. And he says,
Father, stay with me. Don't leave me.
And we watch the hammer go up, and then it comes down.
So, crucifixions are very hard for me to watch because of my love of Jesus and my beliefs system. So it's very hard to watch it. But I do think there's something really powerful in him devolving back to being, in essence, a child and saying, Father, don't leave me, stay with me, right? This moment of pain, this moment of sacrifice, please let me feel you with me, your strength with me as I go through this, right? And what do we talk about in the first part? Like, if you were to look at this as an exploration of let's say, and please don't get offended, people who are listening, like, let's strip it down, and this is just a cult leader's story, right? And you go through this, and there's a lot here that you could just strip it down, that he is just a cult leader who believes what he believes, right? Most cult leaders would not sacrifice themselves in this manner. And I think that's when you have to bring everything back, right? You can strip it down in a certain way, and you can say, oh, he's he's tormented by visions, tormented by voices in his head. Okay, he's got some kind of mental health issues. He believes he's supposed to do this. He starts a movement. He leads a movement. But within the movement, it's about love and stripping away earthly possessions and finding commonality and finding communality and no judgment and all of this. So it's all positive stuff he is saying. And then when you get to this moment, I think this is where it stops being about stripping it down to a cult leader thing or a person with mental health. It's clearly a sacrifice, and in sacrificing himself for his beliefs. And so reaching out to God, who is the voices he's been hearing since the beginning, clawing at his brain to give him a moment of solace or a moment of peace as he endures this, I think is incredibly moving and powerful. And the sounds that those nails make and the sounds he makes as they go in. And then Mary, of course, screaming in pain is devastating.
I think it's incredibly powerful. Now, because you brought it up, I have to, as the resident atheist in the group.
Yes, please.
I think there's lots of examples of cult leaders dying through one form of suicide or another.
Suicide is different. That's self-imposed. Allowing yourself to be killed by others, that's where the delineation for me comes in the difference. Drinking a fucking potion is nothing. Having nails driven through your body and letting other people kill you. Like Jim Jones, that coward drank fucking things and put everything. But instead of facing his punishment and going to jail and going to all these things, instead of facing the retribution for their actions, to me, a cult leader that suicides is a coward's way out. You take the punishment. That's the true person who is a person of faith and really believes in the things that they were talking about. And so for me, that's where I think the delineation comes, but maybe you see it differently. Sorry, I didn't mean to jump.
Oh, no, you'll get no argument from me defending these cult leaders. Absolutely not. I think there is definite delineation, but I do think the idea of the death cult and the idea of the spiritual leader whose journey ends in death is duplicated many, many times. Truth. In many ways. And some of the deaths are quite painful, like being burned alive and things like that have happened. So this leads me to sort of a question that I would ask. I'm trying to think of how to frame it in the right way, which is that we have this character of Jesus as portrayed in this film. Yeah. And in general, we could have a story of Jesus where he is 100% certain of his divinity, 100% certain of his destiny, 100% certain that he is the Son of God as he goes into this moment. And we could have a person who is far, far more human, who, many, many people of faith, they might be 85% certain or 99% certain, but there's always that little bit of doubt. I mean, without that little ingredient of doubt, it's certainty, not faith, and on some level. And so where do you think this particular version of Jesus is on that scale? In other words, is he 100% certain that he's the Son of God, and that, or is there doubt in this moment?
I think there's doubt up until he begs for God to put him back on the cross, and that's what makes this particular version of the Jesus story so compelling and interesting to me, is because if it's the human approach. Humans always have doubt. Even the most ardent cult leader has doubts. It's in the final moment where you accept the fate fully and unequivocally is where the doubts finally leave you. And I think he doubts it all, or else the devil would not have been able to take him off the cross. If he had no doubts, Satan would not have been able to take him off the cross like she does in that with the guardian angel. Doubt is what makes you question your convictions. And if you question your convictions, you can be moved away from your convictions.
For me, I agree. And for me, this is just my personal feeling about it.
Yeah.
The character of Jesus who allows himself to be tortured and crucified, despite his doubts, is more heroic and admirable than the character of Jesus who allows himself to be tortured and crucified, who has no doubts. It's easier if you are 100% sure.
Yeah.
Then this is like, it's going to be several hours of horribleness, and then you're in the presence of God.
Right.
It's if you're not sure, and maybe there's no God at all, and this has no meaning whatsoever, and you still go through it. That's a far more heroic act in my mind.
Yeah. Facing your fear. Absolutely.
They lift him up, and to me, it's almost a version of the classic Scorsese shot of the camera on the dolly moving with the person. Is that the camera is attached to the cross as it rises up?
Yeah.
And there's something really powerful about it. And then we see him lowered into the hole, and he's there again. He's naked on the cross, which is not easy. The way that they have his knees bent under him, is just in terms of the imagery and in terms of his nudity and in terms of its connection to all of the painting of the Renaissance,
right,
is incredible. And also, let's be real clear, and this was very clear in the commentary track, this hurts. This is not comfortable for Willem Dafoe. There were times where they had to take him off because his body started shaking and spasming so hard because it was so hard for him to keep himself in this position.
Yeah.
The sun is beating down on him, and they got to make their day. And it takes 10 or 15 minutes to get him off the cross,
right,
in order to set up. And so there are times where he had to allow himself to be tortured, in order to get the shot. This is not, and that's how important everyone. And you think about Scorsese has 2 days; he has to get it through. And Willem Dafoe, what he allows himself to go through in order to get this is a lot.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. 100% agreed. And and Willem comes from a performance background that is very body connected. If you watch his old stuff when he did for the Steppenwolf Theater, he plays a lot of physically demanding roles where he does stuff with his, shall I say, supine body and his ability to move and what have you. So even if a person who is so well aware of his body, who probably stretches out and does yoga and all these things to make sure his body is in the perfect condition to connect to the roles he's playing, if even he has to be taken off the cross, that should tell you how arduous this section of the film was for him to shoot.
I think it's a really powerful build. His emotionally, as he looks around and sees the other people being crucified, the vulnerability, connected to his nakedness, and there's a sense of pain and shame. And then he says,
forgive them.
Yeah, let's talk about this a moment, because I think Scorsese does an interesting job of giving us Jesus' point of view on the cross. As we look to the left and we look to the right, we're seeing the other people on the crosses with him. And of course, if you know the story, he has the conversations. That isn't here. But they are in so much pain, covered in blood and injury and what have you. And then Scorsese makes a purposeful shot of the crowd ridiculing Jesus. Okay. This is an artist 100% putting himself in the Jesus position, that people are yelling at him, and he is not looking at the Romans. He is looking at the crowd who is making fun of. You see this one older guy come up and start doing little things with his fingers and remedying him and making fun of him and what have you. And you see other people behind him laughing and smiling and pointing at Jesus. They are ridiculing this person who is sacrificing himself, and they do not know. And he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Now, when this is normally told, he is asking God to forgive the Romans for crucifying him and the Pharisees and anybody else. In the way Scorsese frames it here, I think he's taking a little bit of artistic license and essentially yelling at critics or yelling at people who would judge, or the crowd who watches movies, people like us who have our own opinions about creative work on things. And so in a way, he's almost saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, from this place of like artistic purity, So I think that's done on purpose a little bit.
I think first of all, I think that's a great interpretation. I think of almost everything Jesus said, Father, forgive them, is the most meaningful and moving for me.
Sure.
And both in a religious sense, in that, I think there's a connection between him saying, Father, forgive them, and the idea that Jesus died for your sins and you can be forgiven in believing in Jesus. I think it's like Jesus sparks that bit of magic in this moment. And I also think the strength of character of the human to, in the midst of their greatest torture and humiliation, to have their first thought or their primary thought be to forgive the people that are torturing and humiliating him.
Yeah.
This is why, as an atheist, I will always come back to this story,
Yeah.
And always think about it.
It's one of the hardest truths of our lives, is to understand how compelling and important forgiveness is, because it's certainly a very difficult thing when you have had things done to you. You've had people hurt you, destroy you, take away people you love from your life. I mean, like I mentioned, I think in the first part, with what happened with South Africa and Desmond Tutu and others, Bishop Desmond Tutu and others, creating these trials in essence, so that people who were part of the South African white establishment and people who colluded with the South African white establishment could step up and tell their stories and tell what they did and be given forgiveness. Of course, the compelling desire is to destroy and kill and wreak a vengeance. But like we did it when we talked about Judgment at Nuremberg, there is a certain level where you have to come in as the more moral authority to a degree and dictate punishment that is correlative to your morality. It may not be correlative to the actions that were taken. And so I think there's a true power in that, and forgiveness, whether it's a lesser sentence or forgiveness, whether it's just really kind of forgiving the person, is one of the most difficult things you can do. So to be forgiving him while they are crucifying him, I think is incredibly important part of the story, Steve, as you said. And it's one that Scorsese left in for, I think, a very strong reason.
Well, and I've said this before in other ways, but I'm going to say it again here. There's no challenge in forgiving people that haven't hurt you. There's only challenge in forgiving people that have.
Yeah.
There's no, hard structure in compromising with people that you like and agree with. It's only a challenge to compromise with people that you hate and disagree with.
Yeah.
All the challenge exists here in the moment where someone has hurt you. That is when forgiveness is hard.
Yeah.
And this to me is like, the only way we can find peace is to find ways to forgive and compromise and live with the people that we hate and despise, who have hurt us, who we strongly disagree with. That's the challenge of finding peace. And that's the challenge that Jesus, I think, gives us in this moment, you know? And the sound builds and the intensity builds, and he's writhing in pain. His eyes are rolling back in his head. The camera, which I love this shot again, it's a beautiful Scorsese moment. The camera rotates till he's horizontal. And he screams, "Father! Why have you forsaken me?" And then there's an eruption of storm, and then the light changes, and he looks at a cloud as things grow quiet, and he sees the same people who are yelling at him and laughing at him, and the other men on the cross who are being crucified, and yet all the sound is gone, and there's just the sound of a breeze. And this is the critical change in the film.
This is like the John the Baptist scene, where all the sound went out as people were screaming and yelling and doing whatever, because God appeared. So to John, to basically make it clear to him that this was his son. And I think this moment, he says, "God, why have you forsaken me?" And here God appears and strips everything away. And now comes the moment of temptation. And I think that's on purpose. There is one final test, the last temptation of Christ. Is about to happen. And you must go through this final temptation to come into my kingdom,
And they're standing below him on the cross is a blonde girl. And by the way, in the book and in the translation that I read, this character is described as a little Negro boy.
Oh, wow.
And I think the choice to make it a blonde girl, and a British one too, that just reinforcing sort of all of those old biblical epic films that Scorsese was inspired by, I think is really key.
Yeah.
Your Father is the God of mercy, not punishment. He saw you and said, "Aren't you his guardian angel? We'll go down and save him. He's suffered enough."
I think Kazantzakis' genius of saying, let's explore this moment, I think is really profound.
There's no way that the book works without this moment. No way. This is the moment. And this is why this is the moment that pisses off so many people who are of religious upbringing and religious devotion. And I can understand it. I can understand it, although I don't agree. And I'm just as devoted to my religion as anybody else. But I don't agree with their anger and frustration and blasphemous feelings about it. But I understand it, right? It's a difference. I understand it. But I think this is essential for the entire thing to work. is this whole sequence here that we're about to experience.
So I think in a weird way, my Jewishness makes it easier for me to accept this story. And I don't mean that because my Jewishness means that Jesus as a character is not the Son of God in my upbringing. That's true.
Right.
That's not the point I want to make. The point I want to make is that the Talmudic tradition of Judaism is that we argue about the meaning of our stories. That's what the whole Talmud is different scholars and rabbis saying, well, what if it meant this? And what if it meant this?
Right.
And that's what this whole sequence is saying, well, what would this mean? What would it feel like? You know?
Right.
And I think we'll call her the angel for now. I think what she says now is engaging in exactly that kind of idea, because she talks about the story of God ordering Abraham to sacrifice his son.
Yeah.
And she says,
Abraham was just about to kill the boy with his knife when God stopped him. So if he saved Abraham's son, don't you think he'd want to save his own?
This is a book based on the Bible, right? Taking this story from the Bible and the story from other sources and putting a spin on it. What would happen if Jesus was actually human? What would the experience be like? So if you have this moment where this ardent believer who has allowed nails to be hammered into his hands and his feet is taken off the cross, how would you convince them to come with you? Let me use an example from the Bible. Now, how does this also work for you as a reader or a viewer? If you're well aware of that story, it also works for you so that you buy why Jesus might have accepted this logic in this moment of utter pain and turmoil to explore this possibility. So you as the reader and the viewer go, okay, I can see that. I'm going to go with this and see where this leads. So it's very smart of Kazantzakis, I hope I'm saying that right, for using this story, because it is the one story that so many people in the religious community debate and argue about. Why would God have asked Abraham to do this? Why? And then why at the end does he stop him from doing it just to test him? It's such a horrible way to test his love for God. And a lot of people think that it is a terrible story that is actually more detrimental than positive for God, you know. And so it was the perfect story to choose in this moment.
Well, and I think in particular, if you pair the story of Abraham and Isaac with the story of Job and what God did to test Job's faith and what he put him through, I think we get into a position of our feelings about God of like, oh, wow, this guy, this is rough stuff. And I wanted to, and I'm trying to make this digression as quick as possible. But one of the things I found fascinating in this book, God, a Biography, that I had read by this guy, Jack Miles, is one of the things that he talked about. And that he said one of the important things about the book of Exodus is that in the book of Exodus, when Moses goes up to the mountain and comes back with the 10 Commandments, that this is the first time, and like I said, this guy is a serious religious scholar, where there was a pairing of basic ethics and morality with God. Up to that point, God says you should do things because I told you so.
Right.
And as an example of this, when I was raised in my very reformed Jewish tradition, we talked about keeping kosher, which most of us didn't. They said, well, the reason that these kosher laws came from was they were really about health, and that there were these things that would happen that you would get sick. And so all of the ways that we were taught to prepare food was really code for things that were good for you.
Yeah.
And then when I talked to my very orthodox cousin about this exact point, he said, that's what's wrong with Reform Judaism. That's totally wrong. And that the reason that you keep kosher is that God told you to, is that it's a sacrifice. We don't need to put some practical reason why we obey God's laws. We obey God's laws because he told us to do it. And this, when you look at the story of Abraham and Isaac, this makes a lot of sense. Or why men are circumcised. It's because God told you to.
Yeah.
Like, we don't need to put a practical or moral layer on top of that. It's just what God says. And I think particularly in the transition from the Old Testament to the New Testament and the teachings of Jesus, there's far more of an incorporation of morality and ethics and reason, as opposed to because God told you to, you know? And so, like, I just wanted to, that idea of why does God, God tested Abraham All he wanted to know if he was going to pass the test, and then this guy didn't have to die. And that makes perfect sense. All I wanted to know was that Jesus would pass the test. Once I know that he would do that, there's no reason for him to die, as opposed to this is what God told you to do.
Yeah. Look, I have a lot of thoughts on that.
I know, I can tell.
We do not have all the time to cover it, but I am not a fan of that because God told you to, because who interprets God's words? It was men back then from the old times. And how do we know that those men, just like the men nowadays, when they have a taste of power or religious power, didn't manipulate those words to fit certain things, didn't manipulate certain stories to fit certain things? You know, if you study the Bible, and you study most scholars who study the Bible, it was rewritten a number of times. It was not just translated, it was rewritten with certain stories. Some books have been kicked out and lost in certain versions of the Bible. And you see people nowadays who want to change the Bible even more to make him a less forgiving God in the New Testament, to make God more judgmental in the New Testament, to make Jesus more judgmental in the New Testament, and less of a quote unquote wuss than, which is how some people see it. I don't see it that way, but some people do. So this idea that we're just supposed to take what people said centuries ago and be like, oh yeah, they totally got it right, I think is a massive disservice. But you have a right to believe as you believe. So if people do believe that this was the actual word of God, and that there's no need for editing and there's no need for modern interpretation, then you're more than welcome to it. I just don't agree to it at all. And I think a lot of these things were written to fit what was happening at the time. And yeah, that's my point. There's more I could say, but I don't want to offend people because that's not what this show is about.
So first of all, you're sounding dangerously close to me in terms of what my opinion of these things are. And second of all, I don't even think you need to add the layer. I think the layer of people using their translations for power or to push their particular agenda, I think that's certainly a possibility in all of the translations and rewrittens and editing that has happened. But it also could just be what we've been talking about before, of just your basic bias. You hear the story, and these are the things that pop up that are important to you, as opposed to the things that might have popped up that are important to somebody else, you know?
Yeah.
Like, and so then you focus, you change, you know, just little changes in language, you know, can make a huge difference in how we interpret something. And that could just be on, this is how this particular person translated it from the Greek to the Latin or the Latin to the English, you know?
Agreed.
All the pain, that was real.
Yes, but there won't be any more. You've done enough.
And she takes the cross off his head and she draws the nail out of his feet. She kisses his bloody ankle, then the nail from both wrists, kisses on each. It's beautiful the way she takes him off the cross.
I agree with your opinion that it's beautiful, but I did some research over the last few days. The approach from the religious and theologian point of view in terms of how they see this movie. And there's a lot of people who write about how much they hate this moment and they find it sacrilegious that Satan would kiss the wounds of Christ. That people see the sacrifice and the crucifixion as the holy thing Jesus must do in order to die for our sins and enter into the world of God. And they see Satan kissing these wounds as sullying that moment, sullying the wounds, corrupting the wounds, corrupting the sacrifice. So I'd never seen it that way.
Right.
But looking at it from that prism, from a person who is, you know, devoted to this religion, devoted to the story here, I can understand how they might see it that way. And this may be Scorsese's point as well in trying to spark some kind of reaction from the audience as they watch. What we're going to find out later is Satan, which a lot of us probably suspected when we were watching the movie the first time, that it was Satan who was doing this. So having Satan kiss the wounds of Christ is an interesting decision, you know?
So funny. Of course, that never would have occurred to me. I never would have thought about it. And the reason it would never have occurred to me, frankly, I'm going, you know why? Because you're an atheist. That's why.
Right. It would carry the weight for you, of course.
Well, because there's, you know, that expression of someone saying, like, is nothing sacred? And my response to it is generally, although I would not say this, is like, yes, as an atheist, nothing is sacred. Sacred is a word that means something is imbued with some religious importance. Yeah. If I don't think there's a God out there, we can talk about, because in my mind, we should talk about everything. We should explore all ideas.
Yeah.
So there isn't a sense that this moment is 100% sacred, and any sullying is sacrilegious.
Yeah.
That would never have occurred to me, of course.
I'm not the Messiah.
No. No, you're not.
What about the others?
Don't look back there. God gave you life. Look ahead.
There are probably more moments where I could see the wheels turning in your brain in this particular discussion than maybe any other one we've ever had on the Cine-Files.
I just rewatched this sequence, these last 45 minutes, like 3 times before our recording, right? Because I was really struck by that. And I didn't remember. Like, I remembered the child. I remember the stuff. I remember at the end when he accepts going back on the cross. And I remember, obviously, the Mary Magdalene stuff. But I didn't remember how her lines are so universal to the most smallest thing in our lives or the biggest thing in our lives, right? There is always going to be something that tells you not to sacrifice in a certain moment. And it is this voice that says, no, there's another route. There's another path. You don't have to do this. You don't have to get involved. You don't have to chime in. You don't have to say anything. In fact, if you do, you might lose something of value. You might lose something of worth. You might lose something that could lead to you being financially solvent or lead to a future of yours that is safe. And if you do this, you're sacrificing your safe future, right? And she begins this process. And throughout the whole sequence that we're going to talk about, she is that voice that is telling you there is a very safe existence that you can live if you don't pick a side, if you don't chime in on anything, if you just go and have a family, go and eat, go and have children. Yes, lose a wife, but get another one, because apparently, quote unquote, women have the same, different faces, but they're the same energy. All of this stuff you can do, and it is there for you to do if you want to. If you can live with it, you can give in to the voice that tells you that you don't have to make this sacrifice. You don't have to spend hours and hours learning how to shoot the basketball or swing the golf club or learn about or become a lawyer. You don't have to spend all these hours. There's a safer existence. There's an existence with less risk that you can live. And that is what she represents. And it is, in essence, a devil's voice that is telling you to do that. And I wonder if Scorsese, as a creative person as well, made sure to stress that she is the one. Because I'm sure, as we said, this might be representative when we were talking about Raging Bull, how Scorsese almost took his own life because of all the stress and pressure, the cocaine and everything, doubting his own talent. All of this stuff that was making him question whether he should continue as a filmmaker. And I wonder if maybe this is a microcosm of that, while also making it universal. He made it personal and specific to himself.
Okay, now I'm the one with a lot of thoughts.
Yeah.
So to me, here's a distinction I would put forward, which is that Jesus, the story of Jesus, is a story of absolutes. This is the Son of God. This is the person destined to save all of humanity. And in order to fulfill that destiny, he must be tortured to death in the most horrible way. This is not, there's nothing, I'm not going to say there's nothing subtle in the story. I think there's a lot of things subtle in the story, but it's a very black and white story. He has to make this sacrifice,
right. Yes.
or the destiny is not fulfilled. We don't live that kind of life. I think there are plenty of times in life, as a person who tends to take on other people's troubles, and try to solve other people's problems, which, by the way, never works.
No.
Like the statement of or just the very basic, you need to put on your oxygen mask before you can help anybody else. Mm-hmm. It's like me learning how to take better care of myself and I think humans in general going, hey, you know what? I have the right to be happy. I have the right to live my own life. Sure. I have the right to do those things and don't have to suffer constantly because of climate change or because of what, I don't have to do all of that. I think that's correct. And I also think that it's everything that you've said is correct. If you want to be that top, golfer or whatever, you got to make those sacrifices, and you turning away from those things. And frankly, if you want to do the right thing in life, it's real easy to turn away from things in order to go watch your TV or go drink your drink and allow horrible things to happen all around you. And like, so that's why it's like in Jesus, it's a question of absolutes.
Mhm.
For normal humans, it's a question of degrees, you know?
Right. And I'm not speaking like every human being must do. I wasn't meaning that. I'm meaning that there are those of us, and I do include myself, who are called to do something or are called to be a certain way or have that voice that tells us what is the right thing to do and that's what we need to be doing. And there are sacrifices that we need to make in order to achieve that. There are people who are driven to achieve a certain thing. And so those are the people that I'm talking about. There's always the safer route, but it is the harder route that will take more out of you. But it's you've got to make a decision for yourself. What is going to work for you? What isn't? I'm not talking about people who are not called to do anything or not driven to. You can live your life as you see fit. But I think there are certain people that are driven or called to do something, and they must make the sacrifices in order to do it. And it is the constant battle that they have with themselves over the safer choice and the harder choice. And I think that's what she represents. So like, yeah, so that's what I'm saying. And the creative people who are driven to do certain things. So I wasn't trying to say that this is a blanket statement of every human being. I want to clarify that in case that was misinterpreted.
I agree. And I would like to expand this even further. And like, look, this is the last 40 minutes of the film. It gets into some deep stuff. This kind of conversation is what I was actually really looking forward to.
Fair enough.
Is like, I think, so you're talking about the sort of, I have this driven, feeling of destiny to accomplish a thing.
Yes.
And what is required. And that people who continue to go, oh, I should really be accomplishing that thing, but aren't doing the necessary steps. Like, no, you have to go do that stuff. Right. I think that's totally true. I also think there's sort of in what I was thinking of more is there's good to be done in the world. And how much do I sacrifice my own needs or my own life in order to do those things that are good? And what I think, and again, this is why I go, it's not a binary. Because I am one of those people who's driven to accomplish certain things. And also at times I feel overburdened by things that I feel that I am supposed to be doing in both of these senses. And I'll say, which is like I had a pretty rough month. And so when I came home from this last trip to the Bay Area, I made a conscious decision for the weekend to try not to work.
Yeah.
And to just sit and to watch some TV and to play video games. And I still didn't succeed in not working. I still worked many hours that weekend, but I tried really hard. And then what was the thing that I said when we got on the call right before we started recording? I said, I'm having a hard time finding time to write.
Yeah.
And this is the balance is like, I need to carve out time for myself because in order to be healthy and to be happy, like I need that. And B, I need to carve out time to pursue exactly what you're talking about, which is I'm driven to do certain things.
Right.
And that's why it goes like Jesus is a question of absolutes. For us, it's a question of balance, Okay.
As I said, we could go for another 2 hours on this and we have to get through this movie. So
they walk into this beautiful green place, which in contrast to the previous 2 hours of the film it's hugely transformative.
It's lush.
Yeah.
Is this the world of God? The one I spoke about?
No, this is Earth.
Why has it changed so much?
It hasn't changed. You have. Now you can see its real beauty. Harmony between Earth and the heart. That's the world of God. Maybe you'll find this hard to believe, but sometimes we angels look down on men and envy you. Really envy you.
Again, another profound moment in the film. What I think is interesting about it is frequently this is how the world changes for people who discover God.
Yeah.
Find religion.
Yeah.
They see the world transform because their way of seeing the world has transformed.
Yeah.
And he looks down the hill and we see a group of people in white.
What's that?
A wedding ceremony.
Who's getting married?
You are.
And there's Magdalene.
What's wrong? Why are you crying?
I'm thanking God for bringing you here.
And now we're going to go into the life of Jesus that would have happened had he not died on the cross.
Yeah.
Or the life that Jesus chooses when he chooses to step off the cross, depending on how you interpret this.
Yeah.
we're in sort of this home. Light is streaming in, sunlight on him. And she first starts by cleaning up his wounds very, very tenderly. And then she kisses him on his wounds. And then they begin to make love. And what Scorsese says is that, and Scorsese hasn't done a lot of sex scenes in his films. And what he says, it was absolutely necessary to show sex because it is a critical and central part of the human experience.
Yeah, agreed.
We can have a child.
She says this joyfully,
Yeah. And this is, for many people, the moment of highest blasphemy in the whole film.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is where people get, some people were very upset of seeing Christ having sex or a Christ figure having sex. But, God gave us, if you look at the teachings of religion that aren't the puritanical, crazy, in my opinion, crazy teachings, God gave us the ability to have sex as the highest form of expression of love for another person and expression of love for him. Because if you agree to the Christian principles, it is the only time you'd have sex is to procreate. And in procreating, you are doing God's bidding, God's word, right? Never mind that procreating also keeps more people in the Catholic Church and make them money and what that's all connected, I think, and I will never remove that from the thing. But it is supposed to be at its base level, the way it's taught is that that's the connective tissue here. So yeah, I've always not understood why people were upset. I get it because they go, "Oh, Jesus," because the reason they're upset is because they see sex as this terrible thing or this thing that's only for the lower people, lower humanity. It is not for gods. And the truth is, and Judas says that later, which I think is really important, but the truth is, he is, for this interpretation of the story, it works because, again, as you said earlier, Steve, in the first part, like this, the goal is to understand how Jesus became divine through the human journey. And for God to understand the human journey, God must also understand sex. It is the one thing he gave us to procreate, to be able to create more of ourselves, right? So in essence, he must understand this. If he's going to understand all these other things, if that's the whole point of view of the book and of the film, he must also understand lovemaking, not just sex, lovemaking, because there's genuine affection between Mary Magdalene and Jesus. And we saw that at the beginning of the movie. There's legitimate feelings and pain and connective tissues between them. And so for them to consummate it in this way, it's not cheap and tawdry. There's not all kinds of multiple positions. It's very loving. It's very moving and sexual, and it's touching in the way that it's done. And I do understand people getting upset about it, but I also think it's an essential piece of the story. And as you said, what Scorsese said, it had to be shown.
I think, again, take this from the atheist however you like.
Yeah.
But I think one of the most messed up things certain versions of religion have brought to us is our completely bizarre and shame-filled feelings about sexuality.
Oh, 100%. 100%.
I think that's messed us up in all sorts of ways. And I'm not saying that sex isn't serious, and I'm not saying that, we shouldn't take it seriously on some level, but shame and fear and sin and all this stuff, it's like, to me, like if you think of the most delicious tasting apple in the world, and God made this delicious tasting apple,
yeah,
and you take a bite and it's amazing. If you're religious, that's a gift that God gave to you. And if you think of the great joy of human bodies coming together and you believe in God, well, that's a gift that God gave to you. You know what I mean? Like, and so the treatment of it as sin or original sin or shameful or all of those things is just bizarre to me.
Yeah.
And one other thing I should say, and I think it's amazing the way it's shot, is as the camera pulls back in the scene where they're making love, is you see that the angel is sitting there and she is lit so perfectly that you almost don't see her. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
She's like part of the environment. We see Magdalene pregnant, happy, rubbing her belly. She's putting herbs or food in a bowl. And then a wind comes in. She closes the door, back to preparing food. And then she looks up and a bright light hits her and she smiles and we go to white. while we hear that sound of the bird that we heard when God was torturing Jesus earlier in the film. And we know that she has died.
Yeah.
In the book, she is stoned to death by the apostles.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Wow. I would think that's a complete misstep, because if Jesus has come off the cross to buy into this world, why? I guess you would have his apostles turn on him by killing the woman he loves, so that causes division between them.
I don't think he ever finds out that that's who did it.
Oh, I didn't know.
My memory, and my memories of the book are a little bit vague.
Okay.
But I'll be, to be quite honest, the death of Mary Magdalene and then the replacement of her with the other women, I don't understand what this is in the book or in the film either.
Well, and this is what I come back to. And I've said this, I think I said this in the second part. It is difficult sometimes to reckon with Scorsese's treatment of women in his movies. And look, I get Casino and I get these other films like Goodfellas, where you have very strong actresses playing these strong, determined, independent women, although they're almost always tied to their men and almost always tied to De Niro. With this situation here, once again, you have the devil saying this thing, right, about women. I have the quotes somewhere here. There's only one woman in the world with different faces. This is a young Scorsese in 1988 making this movie. I think there's a different approach to how this is all. And I get it's Satan saying it. So Satan is saying these things that women are replaceable or whatever. But in essence, the movie is kind of saying it as well. And I think that's the dangerous part of this, because Jesus does go along with it. Jesus doesn't resist it. Jesus cries over Mary Magdalene, but then the angel goes, guess what? There's other women, dog. There's other women in the sea. And immediately moves him into essentially a prearranged marriage, which was hinted at earlier in the film with her asking him, do you have children or whatever, or them asking him, do you have children? And do you have a wife and whatever? So you get it, but in a way, he's almost, as I said earlier, like tossing away the idea of Mary Magdalene. And unfortunately, she is not fleshed out in the movie as much as she should be. And by the end, the same thing happens to her in the story in this film that happens to her in the original story. She is, in essence, turned into certain things and then discarded when it's necessary to discard her. And I think that's an unfair interpretation of Mary Magdalene. And I like that more modern theologians have explored more of Mary Magdalene's effect and her actual place in the world, and that she might not have been a woman of disrepute or a woman who was who was a prostitute. She might have actually been something else, and that it was other men writing these stories, and that Pope Ezekiel, I think it was, who turned her into a promiscuous woman, or a woman who was a prostitute. So for their own services, hello, Paul. So these things, for their own needs, rather, hello, Paul. So these things that I see here, I think, are troubling sometimes with the early Scorsese films. He might have corrected it by the time we get to Goodfellas and Casino, but still, it was a little bit of an issue to see this in this film for me.
Well, and I put a lot of this at Kazantzakis, and I also put a lot of it with the dude loved Nietzsche. Like he was really into Nietzsche.
Yeah.
Nietzsche, I was looking around and see, here's a quote from Nietzsche about women. He says, "From the beginning, nothing has been more alien, repugnant, and hostile to women than truth. Her great art is the lie. Her highest concern is mere appearance and beauty."
Which is utter horseshit. Because if there's any gender that is told the most lies in our world, it is the male gender. So for fuck's sake, I find that to be one of the most disingenuous interpretations of women that I've ever heard. And it's no surprise with Nietzsche, of course, the God is dead guy, and I've studied Nietzsche. I read Nietzsche. I understand. Nietzsche's for young dudes. Nietzsche is not for intelligent older people. He's not, because you can poke holes in all his points of views and interpretations of things as you get older and more educated, more worldly. You can find so many flaws in his logic. He stayed essentially young in some of the stuff he wrote, but you can poke it to death as you get older.
But my other objection, I think, to the way Mary Magdalene and the way this stuff is it's not really about Jesus. You know what I mean? Like it seems
right.
like it's this idea that he wants to get out about women that isn't as, I don't know. I don't get it. I do love the scene where Jesus is angry and talking to the angel and said, God's killed her. and he's got an axe, and he's like ready to go fight God over this.
Yeah.
And the angel says,
God took her away when she was happy. Now she's immortal. She won't see her love die or body decay. I was there the whole time he was killing her, and I saw what happened.
that is such a weird line.
Yeah. Well, he's trying to divide. Satan is trying to create a divide between God and his son. So by corrupting his mind into thinking these things, and how many people get mad at God because a family member has died, or because early, or something has happened to someone they love through accident, and they blame God, and so that in essence is being addressed in this moment. And Jesus walking out with that axe, is he going to cut the tree of life? Is he going to cut the tree in the Garden of Eden? What is he going to do? And when he's going to fight God, what is he going to take down? And she tries to talk him out of it, because she knows if he goes and confronts God, God can win him back to his side. And so you want to create the division. So she's working on his mind to keep him away from even trying to go and see God. And that's why she leads him to another woman in that moment of pain.
It's very interesting. I hadn't had that interpretation of Satan acting in ways to counter God's plan and preventing Jesus from it. And it's because, and again, this is a much bigger theological question, and I want to ask it, but I want to get it to one point first, which is because it's exactly the thing you're talking about. Because Jesus says,
But it wasn't right. It wasn't right for God to take her.
Which is just what you said, that this is what we do as humans, is we are angry at God for taking away the people we love. And she says, and this is a perfect argument,
You didn't complain when God let you live. You can't complain now because he let her die.
Here's the thing. So this relates to the story of Job. It relates to a lot of stories in the Bible. Does God know what Satan is doing? And is Satan a part of God's plan?
Well, remember, in the telling of Satan, he was his favorite angel and fell to hell because he questioned God and questioned God's plans and God's ideas. He essentially, the way the story is told, is that he essentially became too troublesome to God. And so God, in a fit of anger, banished him to hell, and he runs hell. So he sees himself as an equal to God in many ways. There are other modern interpretations see them as brothers. They are brothers from the same ethereal mother, shall we say. And one chooses one side, one chooses the other. That's why Cain and Abel is one of the first stories in the Bible, in essence. And so to me, that's when you look at this, he knows exactly how to counter everything and to play. And I think God must allow that to exist in order to create the idea, in order to accentuate the idea of free will. Like, that is one of the biggest tenets in the Bible and in the stories of religion, is free will. You choose, right? And I don't think it's an accident that Schrader has this how can we call, Satan, the Satan angel say, you chose to come off the cross, and you chose to do this. You chose to pursue this life. You know what I'm saying? And you chose all that could happen with this life. And now, because you've lost your life, the woman you love, you're just going to turn your back on God or fight God. That's not how this works. And so, yeah, I do think there are elements of God's plan in what Satan is doing, and it all has to be there, because we, as essentially the battlefields, if you believe in the religion, the battlefields for God and the devil, we have to have free will in order to choose one way or the other. And that's how we're judged at the end of our lives. If you believe again in the stories, that's how we're judged when we die and go to heaven. Which path did we choose, and how many times did we choose that path in our lives and in critical moments in our lives? Yeah. So yes, I do think God, or Satan rather, is part of it all.
Well, this goes into sort of these fundamental paradoxes as you dig into religion. And first of all, like are we talking about Lucifer or Satan or the serpent or it's like, and whether or not those are actually all the same thing depends on how you interpret the text.
Like the Trinity.
There's also the thing of like, well, if Satan is capable of making changes in our lives and doing terrible things, then how can you say that, hey, you got to trust God's plan unless those horrible things that Satan is doing they have to be a part of God's plan.
Right.
And if everything is a part of God's plan, then you get into this, well, what exactly is free will? Like if this whole sequence is a part of God's plan, which makes sense to me. I actually think it makes the sacrifice that Jesus makes at the end of his life, having experienced this real life, it is profound.
Yeah.
And so you could totally say that it's part of God's plan for Satan to tempt Jesus with this life, knowing, because God knows everything, that Jesus will actually make the correct choice at the end, having experienced all this. But then you get into these loops of was there any free will here ever to begin with,
Yeah.
And those loops we're going to avoid because otherwise we'll never get to the end of the film.
That's a different podcast. Yeah, exactly.
And then we get to this point that you just said.
There's only one woman in the world. One woman with many faces. This one falls, the next one rises.
And she brings up Lazarus' sisters. And I hate this whole concept in the film. I really do.
Yeah.
I just, it's just very, this idea that all women are the same and interchangeable in some ways, I don't like it.
No. But what else would the devil say?
Yeah, that's true too, I guess.
Yeah.
We see them moving towards this beautiful stone arch, and there is Mary, Lazarus' sister, and she's happy to see him because he's this great rabbi who raised her brother from the dead.
Master, I want to tell you one thing. I'm sorry about Magdalene. I won't ever leave you alone again. I'll always protect you. I don't want you to take the wrong road and get lost again.
Which is the wrong road?
Oh, going back to God, of course. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. That's the wrong road, going back to God. Like, you wanted to sacrifice yourself for God. You don't need to. You're not the Messiah. You are meant to be a human on earth and have love and have kids and whatever. And if you start messing with believing in God again or believing you're the Messiah, that's the wrong road because it'll lead to pain and torture and death. Yeah.
Because I was also like, well, is Magdalene's death because of the wrong road? Was that that's where or because it's also him saying he's going to attack God when he's got the axe. That also could be the wrong road.
No, because Satan doesn't care. The only thing Satan wants to do is keep Jesus away from God. That's all he wants to do.
She welcomes him in, and the music is very religious as they embrace. And then now we see little kids.
Yeah.
Jesus is older. The angel asks if he has any complaints, and he says none.
I'm ashamed when I think of it.
Of what?
Of all the mistakes I've made. Of all the wrong ways I looked for God.
That the right ways, it seems like, is family and love and children. And for that, those are the right ways for lots of people.
For humans, yes.
Yeah. Right. And then we're there, and instead of being with Mary, it's Martha, also older, and she invites him to come inside. And he resists, and the angel says,
There's only one woman in the world. Go inside.
And he goes inside. Just to be clear, what's the implication of this?
What do you mean? Which part? Going inside?
What is happening when he goes inside with Martha?
He's essentially accepting to marry her and move on from Mary Magdalene and pursue this life now.
No, hold on. He's already moved on with Mary, Lazarus' other sister, and they have kids together.
Right.
Or I think we have additional kids. I think this is him having both Mary and Martha as his wives.
Oh, maybe. Yeah, very possible. Right. Which is interesting. Right. Yeah. Okay.
Because there's only one woman in the world.
Right.
Which, and by the way, a guy having multiple wives at this time in history was not an unusual thing at all.
That's true. Yeah.
And then we're out in the town and we hear someone making a speech, and Jesus wants to hear the speech. And there is our old friend who was named Saul, is now named Paul, Harry Dean Stanton.
Yeah.
And he talks about the evil life he lived as Saul.
I gambled, I whored, I drank, and persecuted, tortured, and murdered. Yes, murdered! I killed anyone who broke the law of Moses, and I loved it. I enjoyed it. I relished it. I reveled in it because I thought I was doing God's will. I thought I was doing God's will.
And then he tells the story the famous story where Saul on the road to Damascus is hit by a bright light that blinds him, and that is where he hears the word of Jesus.
Yeah.
I find this whole thing fascinating. And while I think the casting of Harry Dean Stanton, particularly in the earlier scenes, is totally bizarre,
Yeah.
I strangely enough like him here, and in particular in the next scene with Jesus.
100%. I agree with you 100%. Yeah.
I mean, it's weird casting.
Yeah, but it works.
And he tells the story, which is, Saul who became Paul is, one of the main people to spread the good news. And the good news means the Gospels. That's what good news means, or Gospels mean.
It's about Jesus of Nazareth. He was not the son of Mary, he was the Son of God. His mother was a virgin, and the angel Gabriel came down and put God's seed in her womb. That's how he was born. And he was punished for our sins. Then he was tortured and crucified. But 3 days later, he rose up from the dead and went up to heaven. Death was conquered. Amen.
So this is not the story that we saw. This is the traditional story that he is now telling. What does it mean? And I don't know that there's an answer to this question, but what does it mean that Paul is telling this story when we know that Jesus has lived and did not die and did not rise up from the dead?
I think you have to keep going with the scene. So we get to that moment where Jesus himself asks this question of Paul.
Why are you telling these lies?
What are you talking about?
I'm the son of Mary and Joseph. I'm the one who preached in Galilee. I had followers. We marched on Jerusalem. Pilate condemned me and God saved me.
So now Jesus is arguing with the story of his life, right?
Jesus himself is saying, this is really important. People want to talk about sacrilege. This is the real moment of sacrilege, because this is essentially Scorsese using the movie to make a commentary about religion and about these stories, and maybe even to kind of give some credibility to these ideas that were becoming more and more a part of the conversation at the time in the late 1980s about the Bible being rewritten and the Bible being reinterpreted and certain stories being taken out and certain things being written to go a certain way, and more of the historical exploration of the pagan stories that were told for other other saviors, other messiahs in the BC times, mirroring some of the same stories or some of the same elements of the story of Jesus Christ. So there was a lot of that happening, I think, back in the late 1980s as it was blossoming into the 90s, and now, even up to now, these conversations about God and the different interpretations of God and the stories and the historical connections and all of that stuff. And so I think him having, which I think is fascinating, is him having Jesus say, well, wait, the truth is this. And Paul saying, well, the legend is what I can market. The legend is what people need. The legend of your story is what I'll do. So if I have to crucify you, I'll crucify you. If I have to raise you, I'll raise you. Whatever it is I have to do in order to get people to buy into this religion so they can get some benefit of it and live a happier life, I'm going to do, because that's the bigger picture. That's the better usage of your story than if you got off the cross. So this is the beginning of the eroding of the decision that he made to get off the cross. Because if you remember, the little Satan girl is the one tries to stop him from talking to Paul, because they're walking, and it's Jesus who turns around and goes back, and she's like, "There's nothing to see there." And again, the symbolism of turning around and going back. Right? What does she tell him? Don't turn around. Look at those people who are crying for you on the cross. It doesn't matter. You've moved on. Don't turn around and worry about the death of Magdalene. Move forward to Lazarus' sister. So very much it's about, don't look back there, don't worry about it, go forward. And so when he turns around and defies her and goes and talks to, by the way, free will, goes and talks to Saul and listens to Saul and confronts Saul, or is Paul now rather, their back and forth is what she was afraid of. And that is the beginning of the undercutting of what the devil is doing here, because he is showing him, or she is discovering how his story is being used in a certain way so that people buy into religion and have a happier approach to their world, because his sacrifice does matter. His sacrifice on the cross is what people hold on to in order to light the way for them in how they need to carry out their lives, so to speak. So, yeah.
Several thoughts. The first is that as an atheist, I don't need Jesus to commit any magic tricks to think the things that he said are awesome. It has nothing, because the value in the things that he said are the things that he says, not whether he was the Son of God or not the Son of God, or was resurrected or not resurrected, because I'm an atheist, right? Okay. But for many people, the thing that makes the story big is that he came back from the dead. It is the great miracle. It is the resurrection.
Well, it's the crucifixion and the resurrection. You cannot have one without the other. They're both essential to the story of Jesus, because that's what he sacrificed for us, and that he was rewarded with that, just like we would be rewarded,
right,
if we sacrifice ourselves in a certain way for him, right? I don't mean crucifixion. I mean other things.
Right. Well, and as an atheist, I don't see an afterlife. So therefore, the only doing good in the world is its own reward. I don't need another reward because there's no afterlife.
The question is, though, for you atheists, is where did you get your morality? Where did you get your understanding of all of this stuff if it wasn't religious based? Because religion pretty much spread throughout the entire world, the Catholic religion, including Rome, which is why Rome eventually stopped having gladiator contests. It was because that emperor of Rome at the time, I can't remember, he embraced Catholicism and Christianity and wanted all of that banished, and it was, which is why we still have the Rome Colosseum as a ruins. But that's when it stopped, is when Catholicism spread across the globe. So you could argue that all these things you atheists believe in, your morality, your ethics, your morals, that you don't need God to tell you this stuff, the only reason you have that is because people embrace the Catholicism, the religion and morality and ethics of life through religion. So I always find that to be an interesting thing to dive into and strip back all the way back to its beginnings. And I'm not saying that that's what I 100% believe, but I wonder if it's maybe the reason why. And so just throwing it out there in my mind as we're talking about it, because I never try to convert anybody. Believe what you want to believe, as I do. But I also think there's the religion and atheism are tied much more strongly than people think, I guess I would say.
So how to respond? Here's how I will respond.
Yes.
And this literally, I've talked about this book on faith that I'm writing, and literally a section is the tremendous advantage religious text has for propagating moral codes among a society. If you looked at two societies, and one society had their moral code connected to religious beliefs, which involved tremendous punishments after life, and one that didn't, and you said, where's the moral code going to be stickier? Mm-hmm. There's an advantage to the moral code that is presented through a religious idea. I think has nothing to do with whether or not the religion is true or not true. It simply has to do with, if you tell a little kid, hey, you're going to go to hell if you do this thing, that's a motivator, or God will support you if you do this other thing. That is a motivator. Sure. Totally true.
Yes.
The idea that morality is connected irrefutably to religion is completely not true. And the idea.
How do you know that?
Well,
how can you
first of all, I'm an atheist, and I think I'm a moral person.
Yeah, but you're an atheist now in 2024. Sure. You don't know that the tenets of atheism that you gravitated to weren't born from the religious influence of cultures centuries and centuries ago.
There is no question.
You can't definitively say that.
There is no question that I have been affected by religious traditions in terms of morality. And as I said, and this comes from that lecture, is there is a definite connection between Exodus and the introduction of the 10 Commandments and the idea of connecting religion to God. But if you look at Greek society or Roman society, in which Zeus or Apollo or Jupiter had no connection to morality in the sense that a Judeo-Christian tradition has, was there no morality in Greek or Roman cultures previous to Christianity?
You want me to show you some of the pedophilia?
You want me to show you some of it that existed in the Catholic Church 20 years ago?
I've never seen anything like that. If
pedophilia in the Catholic Church?
I swear to God, I've never seen anything. Oh, no, you're talking about priests. That's different. Priests doing that to children, that is the human foibles. They are not celebrating that in artwork. And I think there's a difference there. There's a shame in pedophilia The priests are doing it out of, and it's horrible that they're doing it, and they should be punished to the fullest extent of the law. But there is shame involved in that, right? And I think with the Greek approach, when you see the artwork, that's celebrating pedophilia. There's a difference, right?
There is a celebration of torture, violence, all sorts of horribleness throughout the history of the Catholic Church.
100%, sure.
Yeah. And there is a
human
tradition
made. That's human made. Right?
And there, of course, because humans are not necessarily, humans are not perfect. Humans have all sorts of foibles. And if you read,
we can't keep any of this, by the way. Go ahead, yes, keep going.
If you read Plato, if you read any text of any culture, there is morality, like the ideas of morality. Now, our ideas of morality have evolved from the times of the Greeks or the Romans, but it's not like the Catholic Church came along or the Greek Orthodox Church came along and they solved all these problems. They committed all sorts of immoral, horrible, awful things throughout history. And if you look at cultures, whether it's Native American cultures or African cultures or Chinese cultures, there's all sorts of morality throughout these cultures, some of it connected to religion, some of it not.
Right. But how much of how can I say this? Can you quantify the Greek effect on people versus the religious effect on people? And I don't know many people that were raised on the Greek script, the Greek stories as teaching them morality. You know what I'm saying? And okay, there's another notice. So I don't know. And I guess that's where I would want to explore more is where is the real demarcation point or demarcation line about where it became this versus this, because you can quote me Oedipus and Aeschylus and all this stuff you want, but most children aren't being taught that until they get to fucking high school. They're not being taught that when they're children, right?
Yeah, but it's just
morality. But
where's
morality?
As you said to me is you said, but it's just as you said to me. I say I'm an atheist and I believe I'm a moral person. You say, yeah, but you've grown up in a world that was formed by Judeo-Christian traditions, which I think is perfectly true. Yeah. We also grow in a world that was formed by Greek traditions, since rules about democracy, Plato's Republic, aesthetics, Aristotle, all of these things are core things in terms of Western civilization. Sure. And many, many of them touch on ideas of morality and what it is to be good and what does that mean. And those are not connected to religion in the sense that...
yeah, that's fair. Yeah, that's actually an interesting point. Okay.
Well, and to make the broader point is that I personally believe that part of why morality exists is that it is useful in terms of civilization, in terms of
100%.
Cultural evolution, is that if there's no morality and I want your stuff and so I just kill you and take your stuff, our civilization is not likely to survive. Is that we have to have rules of morality in order to deal with us. That's why they exist. And yes, they're codified in terms of religious practices, and religious practices are useful for codifying, but that's not their origin. I think there was morality way back in the cave days when they decided not to just rape and kill everybody. They might go like, we're not going to rape and kill anyone in our civilization. We're going to go do it to that other civilization. And that's the level of morality at that time.
How can you possibly... You have no idea what they were thinking back in the caveman days. You're speculating what might have gone on back in those times, and that they would even have remote intelligence to decipher morality from what we would see morality as nowadays as a more elevated society than the caveman days.
Well, it certainly evolved. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Just as it's evolved from Roman times to our times, just as it's evolved from the Middle Ages to our times.
Sure.
I hope it's evolved from the 60s to our times,
Yeah.
Like we continue to add things, hopefully.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say, I don't know if I 100% feel that way.
Oh, I 100% feel that we have evolved in the last 50 years. And I also feel in the last 10, we've devolved a bunch.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, thanks for listening to this short for...
Look, this is why this last part is important to talk about.
You see, you don't know how much people need God. You don't know how happy he can make them. He can make them happy to do anything. He can make them happy to die, and they'll die. All for the sake of Christ. Jesus Christ. Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of God, the Messiah.
So I think there is an argument. We talked about what is, in fact, the most sacrilegious part of this film. And I think you and I both strongly were affected by Jesus building crosses at the beginning.
Yeah.
Some people think, as you mentioned, was Satan actually kissing the wounds of Jesus in the crucifixion, whether it was Jesus actually engaging in the act of love with Mary Magdalene. All of these things could be interpreted as sacrilegious.
Yeah.
This argument that Paul is making right here is such an atheist argument. It is such an argument that could be saying, as you said, well, it could be that there's just a whole bunch of people who are using and manipulating and creating this story to get people to do what they want, including make them die or kill, which it has, without question. This story has been used to make people die and kill throughout history.
Yeah, and I think that's Scorsese taking creative license with this back and forth to reestablish that or reaffirm that here in the dialogue, because both things can be true. But of course, it's all leading to one thing. Both, as I said, one thing can be true in that Jesus can live, but they need to tell the story a certain way, so it's being told that way, right? But in essence, underneath all of this is the reaffirmation that Jesus must sacrifice himself, because the story is good and it's fine, but the story doesn't hold weight without his sacrifice. And I'll read you 1 Corinthians 15, 16 through 18. This is Paul's words here in the Corinthians. If Christ is not raised, then our preaching is in vain, and our faith and your faith is in vain. If Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, and you are still in your sins. And those who have fallen asleep in Christ, for example, those who died as believers, have perished, just perished. So this is, again, leading back to he must accept the crucifixion in order for the story to carry weight. So Paul can say all he wants, but if Jesus lives, it's just a countdown clock to what we're going to see in the next few scenes, the burning and destruction of Jerusalem. And then the apostles confronting Jesus because he didn't sacrifice himself. Because if he doesn't, the stories will not carry weight and the scripture will not come true. The prophecy will not come true. And in essence, we will not have had our sins washed away by a sacrifice.
I'm going to present to you a heretical interpretation.
Hysterical or heretical?
Heretical.
Okay.
Well, we'll see. It might become hysterical. We'll see how it goes. But I'm going to present the multiverse interpretation of what's going on.
Oh, shit. Okay.
So we could say that Satan tempts Jesus and that Jesus comes off the cross and then goes through this temptation, in the end makes the decision to sacrifice himself, which is what he has to do. And in that universe, he does die for our sins. He is resurrected, and everything in this tradition is true. Or we could say that this is a multiverse situation, and that in one situation, that's what happened. And in another situation, Jesus wasn't resurrected. He wasn't the Messiah. He was not the Son of God. And a bunch of people went out and told exactly the same story as if he hadn't been resurrected. And we are in our world today, right now. The same belief system, the same stories told about Jesus, except for the fact that he was never resurrected. He was not the Son of God. And that is a multiverse thing where you can't know which multiverse you're in, because both have exactly the same traditions and stories being told.
But here is the mistake you make. And you rarely make mistakes, but here's where I think you make the mistake, in that in all the multiverses, and we've seen this in Marvel and DC, there is always one hero who does the action that another hero does in every one of the multiverses. So to me, in every multiverse, there is a Messiah that dies and sacrifices himself or herself for all our sins in that particular multiverse. I believe that there is a Messiah that is the Son of God or the daughter of God and sacrifices themselves for our sins so that we can create a new covenant with God. There must be. And so that's just that's what I believe.
But that's just your faith.
Of course. Just as that's just your brain telling you one thing. It's no.
My brain is merely postulating a possibility.
Right. And I'm telling you.
And your brain is projecting
that it isn't possible. Yeah. Because in order to connect multiverses, certain actions have to exist in all the multiverses. And we know this, as I said, through DC or Marvel or any of them.
No, I won't allow you to use DC and Marvel as evidence. They're fictional properties.
Multiverses are fictional anyway. So,
okay, so I will now throw out the multiverse and merely say that it is perfectly possible that Jesus died on the cross, and then Paul and a bunch of other people made up all these stories about him.
Sure. It's perfectly possible that Jesus died on the cross.
Yes.
So you're saying he did sacrifice himself.
Well, I'm saying he died on the cross. I don't know if he sacrificed himself.
Well, I would think dying on the cross is a sacrifice.
Well, as Pontius Pilate said, 3,000 people died on the cross.
Sure.
I don't know that they sacrificed themselves. I don't know that Jesus told Judas to go make sure that I was arrested because I have to die on the cross. I have no historical evidence of that at all.
Well, if I accept your possibility, you must also accept that there was a Son of God as the counter. You must also accept there's a Son of God.
I don't have to accept there's God.
And all these stories are true.
Oh, yes, it is absolutely possible that these stories are true.
Yes.
100% acknowledge that. Totally.
Fair point.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I cannot disprove God.
Yeah. I'm not saying, look, it's very possible that there is no, that this were all stories and there was no Son of God, there is no Jesus. Of course, it's all very possible. But in order to have that possibility, you must also have the possibility that there was a Son of God, there was a sacrifice, there was a crucifixion, and he did die for our sins. So both of them, they must exist in order to achieve balance in the universe and in the world. So I have no rejection of that because I always seek balance. So, yeah.
You're the person who must find balance in the Force.
I must, yes, which is why I was mad at Anakin, because he was the chosen one. It was said he would bring balance to the Force. Anyway, all right.
I love the end where Harry Dean Stanton, and it is, again, I'll say, the most bizarre casting in the world.
Oh, yeah, but it works.
But this totally works. Yeah. And the end where he says,
I'm glad I met you, because now I can forget all about you. My Jesus is much more important and much more powerful. Thank you. It's a good thing I met you.
It's an amazing scene.
Yeah, it is, right? Yeah.
I think, and the fact that you and I have talked probably for 40 minutes about this 4-minute scene shows just how and Jesus is shook up after this conversation.
Yeah. But look, it's also the idea of legend, right? And it's also, if you want to connect it to what Scorsese was using this Satan girl to essentially, or is what I said earlier about Jesus forgiving the people who are making fun of him. You could argue that there are probably people who meet Scorsese and be like, well, I don't like this version of Scorsese. I'm going to keep my version of Scorsese. It was nice to meet you, but I have my vision of Scorsese and you don't have to, I can forget you, but this version of Scorsese I like. The legend, the story, right? This legend must live on. So in essence, he's constructing and deconstructing at the same time in this conversation with him and Jesus, which I think is a fascinating commentary on legend and celebrity worship.
It's much later. Jesus is now an old man, and the angel says that she's leaving him.
You've done well. We've both done well.
And then we hear a scream.
Get inside! Get inside! They're killing everyone! Jerusalem is on fire! It's burning! The Romans are killing everyone! The city's gone! They're killing everyone!
And we see the flames through the gate and all the people panicking. And this is, I would assume, we've reached 70 AD, which is when Rome destroyed Jerusalem. And then Jesus is dying. And it's reminiscent of the moment that the abbot in the desert died at the very beginning of the film.
Oh, yes, good point.
He's lying down, and in come the very old apostles led by Peter. And he recognizes them.
Peter, is that you? What happened to you?
I got old.
And then we hear or get the sense that one of them, John, was tortured by the Romans, and that the Ark of the Covenant has been stolen, which we'll later find in the Well of Souls in Raiders of the Lost Ark, obviously.
So 2 things that are really important. The devil says, you've done well, we've done well. That's important because in essence, he's kissing his own ass for having steered Jesus away from God, or so he thinks. And then this moment where Peter brushes Satan aside and says, move away, girl. We were called to be here by God. So there is a power in that, right? Satan cannot overcome God, cannot, never will. And so Satan kissing his own ass, perfectly legible, perfectly correct, because Satan would kiss his own ass because he was always caught up with his own vision of greatness, which is why it's a sin. And then this Paul pushing him aside. Paul can, because Paul is called by God. Paul is the one, even though he denied God 3 times, he still spreads his word, spreads the scripture, builds the church. So Peter, it's an important thing for Peter to do that. So brushing aside Satan, which I think is incredible. So I love that. And Satan doesn't protest because Satan can't overcome God.
I would never have had those thoughts. Like just because
You're a bleeding atheist guy.
Exactly. That is exactly why I would never have had those thoughts.
There's someone else outside.
Be careful, he's still angry.
And there's Judas in the door.
Yeah.
Judas. Oh, I missed you so much.
He hears you. He just won't say anything.
He's been fighting in Jerusalem. Look at his hands. There's still blood on them.
I think it's really powerful.
Judas has gone back to his old ways.
Yeah.
It's very powerful, I agree.
Judas, the master is speaking to you. Answer him.
Traitor! This all makes perfect sense in the way that the story is structured in this version of the telling of the story of Jesus.
Your place was on the cross. That's where God put you. When death got too close, you got scared and you ran away and hid yourself in the life of some man. We did what we were supposed to do. You didn't. You're a coward.
He's right.
I agree. In this telling of the story, he is 100% right.
Yep.
And then the moment where he says,
Rabbi, you broke my heart. Sometimes I curse the day I ever met you. We held the world in our hands. Remember what you told me. You took me in your arms and you begged me, betray me.
and he's crying again. I'm going to say it for like the 4th time. And it's true. This is my favorite Harvey Keitel performance.
I didn't agree with you until I rewatched this scene again. As I said, rewatched this section 3 times, and I just found myself transfixed by Harvey. So yeah. I feel like I have to agree with you on this.
It's so powerful, and he manages to be so incredibly strong,
yeah,
and so vulnerable simultaneously.
And I loved you so much. I went and betrayed you. And you, what are you doing here?
It's great.
Everything. As I said, in preparation for this final conversation on this film, I read a couple of things, and I read a thesis or theory, an analysis, I guess I would say, someone had, where this film is not about God at all, or Christ at all. It's about Judas. That Judas is the heart of the film, not Christ.
I totally agree.
Right. And I had not seen it that way, right? Because we're initially introduced to a very angry Judas, but is angry because he feels betrayed by Jesus. And Judas comes around to Jesus. Now, we don't fully see Judas come around to Jesus, but we accept that because he doesn't kill him and he stays his follower, right? And he is the strongest of all of them. When they doubt, he doesn't. When they want to run and question things, he doesn't. When they want to do these things that are following Jesus, riding Jesus' coattails, Judas doesn't. And Jesus asks Judas to make the ultimate sacrifice, which is to serve him up to the Romans. So the scene is going along well, and I agree with everything Judas is saying to him and calling him out, because how many people in our lives have we called out for saying they were going to do one thing, whether they be politicians, religious leaders, our family members, people who are part of the community, who are leaders in the community. They said they were going to do this, but they didn't. They betrayed us. They're liars. They're traitors. It's not until he says, "You made me betray you," that I was like, oh, fuck. There's a responsibility here, of course. And this is the moment. This is, to me, the winning point for Judas to say, you made me violate our friendship. You made me break my heart in half for you. I loved you. I cared about you. You were my friend. You were the person I loved. I caressed you. You fell asleep in my arms. I fell asleep in your arms. We were connected beyond a normal connection. We had this love of each other as people, right? I don't mean sexual love. I mean just love as human beings. And so the fact that you asked the greatest sacrifice of me which was to betray you to the people I hate the most, the Romans, and then you didn't go through with it. You are a selfish coward, an asshole, and you shattered me into pieces for your own selfish benefit because you didn't have the guts to go through with what you were called to do. And I think that's the point that pushes the argument over the line for Jesus and motivates him to do what he does next, or in a couple of seconds.
Well, and in the next moment, as Judas yells at him, "Why weren't you crucified?" Suddenly there is blood again on Jesus's wrists. And it's interesting that the apostles are like, "Hey, you know what? Leave him alone. He's done enough," basically.
Led by Peter.
And then Jesus says,
"No, you don't understand. The guardian angel. God sent the guardian angel to save me."
Angel? What angel? Look at her.
And suddenly the angel has become the flames of Satan.
I told you we would meet again.
If you die this way, you die like a man. You turn against God, your Father. There's no sacrifice. There's no salvation.
It's funny. We were saying how so much of this is Judas's movie. I think the weakness of the movie is really the character of Jesus in the way that he's portrayed. I think he's not, like, if this were a buddy picture, he's not up to the level of what Harvey Keitel, and I'm not criticizing Willem Dafoe's performance. No. In the way the character is created, it's not at the level.
But it's not supposed to be. And I think that's important because he is questioning constantly his role as this son of God. And so he has to be by the very nature weak or indecisive or manipulated or able to be manipulated. And Judas has to be the morning star. He has to be this constant. And it's important to have the balance because that's the story they're telling of this particular version of Jesus, which is why this particular version of Jesus upset so many religious people, because they don't see him having conviction. They don't see him having true, strong beliefs. They don't see him doing the normal things that we have been told and drilled into our brains that Jesus did, which was to be very clear about who he was, very much accepting the role of being the Son of God, accepting what he had to do in service of the Lord, and never questioning it, right? Except for one moment where he's in the garden and gets to be what he says, like, let this cup pass over me. And when he's on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? Those are the only two moments of questioning that you have from Jesus. But those two moments are so out of balance with the numerous moments where he is very clearly not questioning God or his role in all of this. So it's you have to have that, I think, to have the Judas part, you have to have Jesus who's a little more. But maybe it's just, you just don't enjoy that approach to it. I don't know.
Well, I mean, it's sort of what we talked about in the last part of that moment, which I think both of us wished, where Jesus showed him turning the other cheek, or had those moments of strength, or had those moments where you saw how he convinced Judas. That's what I think is missing. Anyway, but at this moment, I don't feel that way at all, because the moment after Jesus has seen that that it's Satan that has created this life for him, that and realizes that there will be no new covenant, that there will be no redemption without sacrifice, and he crawls out of the bed and across the room. Yeah. It's really powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and in a way, it is we talked about whether or not Jesus chose to be sacrificed in a historical context.
Mm.
This choice to leave his deathbed and crawl painfully back to the cross is more powerful to me than being betrayed by Judas and captured by the Romans.
Yeah, in essence, he is carrying the cross again.
Yeah.
By crawling in this hole all the way back to that moment. He must retrace his steps back to that moment. And all because he's crawling, as a lot of people would say on the religious side of things, you bow in front of God. And so crawling is a way of bowing,
sure,
movement, so to speak. Yeah.
And he's obviously in agony as he crawls through the riots up back towards where the crucifixion was. And now we get to this moment where he essentially has to beg God the Father to put him back on the cross and resume his crucifixion. And Willem Dafoe faced this acting moment as a huge challenge. He went, I can't do this halfway. I must give all of myself to this performance. He did 100% everything he had in the first performance. And it was this is Willem Dafoe's description, a complete and total failure. Marty knew that it was a complete failure.
Yeah.
He felt completely humiliated in front of the crew. Like it was such a terrible disaster that he took that humiliation, and that's what drove him to do the next take, which was the take.
That's the take. Yes.
Father, are you still there? Will you listen to a selfish, unfaithful son? I fought you when you called. I resisted. I thought I knew more. I didn't want to be your son. Can you forgive me? I didn't fight hard enough.
I think his performance is great.
Yeah, incredible.
Yeah.
Playing humiliation and feeling humiliation are two different things.
I want to bring salvation. Father, take me back. Make a feast. Welcome me home. I want to be your son. I want to pay the price. I want to be crucified and rise again. I want to be the Messiah.
Can I tell you the crazy thought? Every time before we do a recording, I reread my notes.
Yeah.
And I'm rereading this moment, and I suddenly went, you know what this reminds me of someone begging and saying, take me back. Take me back. I want to go back. I suddenly pictured Jimmy Stewart on the bridge in It's a Wonderful Life.
Yeah.
And I'm like, this movie is a reverse twisted mirror image version of It's a Wonderful Life, because you spend most of it watching this person's life.
Yeah.
And then this angel comes down and creates a fantasy for them. And both of it's what they ostensibly wanted. One is the world would be better if I didn't exist. And one is, how can I live without having to make this sacrifice? Yeah. And in the end, they have to come back to the same place where at their death, which was George jumping off the bridge or the crucifixion, and beg God to give them the real life back that includes the sacrifice.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And It's a Wonderful Life is connected to religion and redemption and all of those things.
And appreciating life.
Yeah.
And you know, again, these are universal stories. This is why this appeals so strongly, you know, because you can take a certain way out, but if it, in the end, can you live with it? And if you can't live with it, that's the moment it comes back and hits you eventually, that you can't live with it and you must go back to this other place. And it's the same thing. There's always an easy way out, but you've got to learn, you've got to be able to live with it if you take the easy way out.
It's also, and this is so many religious people that I've talked to who've talked about one version or another of their bottom and reaching out to God in that moment and saying, take me back. I want to pay the price. Not that they're the Messiah, not that they're doing what Jesus is doing, but like the moment of I'm willing to live with this suffering because my faith will help me and I need my faith to get through life. That's universal.
Yeah. It's about confronting. It's about confronting your deepest fears, your deepest flaws, your scariest moments, the things you don't want to confront. That is getting up on the cross. It is not about actually physically sacrificing yourself with nails through your wrists or whatever. It is, or through the area they're supposed to go through. But like, it's about confronting these things that scare us the most, confronting these things that we fear the most because we're afraid of what it's going to do to us. But in fact, if we don't confront them, the other side of it is so much worse, because we'll live a life of fear, we'll live a life of self-hatred, and we'll live a life consumed by our cowardice. And that's the toughest thing. And look, agree or don't agree, that's just how I see it. And I think that's why these stories resonate with all of us so much, because all of us are confronted with things we have to deal with, and the emotional pain or the physical pain we sometimes have to endure in order to confront the things that we have to confront. And it's not always easy, and it's terrible. And, you know, as I said, from my own personal experience in 2016, confronting all of that to try to find my way out of it, you know, the easier route was to take my life in that moment. The harder route was to climb out of that hole. And in no way am I judging anyone who takes their lives, because I think there's There is a strength in being able to do that, but the harder route is to climb through the hole and climb out the hole. And that's just how I look at it, having been through it myself.
Well, and for many people, the most important secret to climbing out of that hole is faith in God.
Yeah. Yes.
You know?
Yeah.
And this is why, for me as an atheist, I would never, ever argue against that for anybody.
Yeah.
Because we all face those moments, and anything that can help you to climb out, anything that can help you to find hope in your life, I'm for, unless it involves hurting other people. As soon as you bring in other people, that's a different thing.
I agree with you.
Yeah. And then Jesus is back on the cross, and he looks around, and then he laughs and smiles and then says,
It is accomplished!
It is accomplished.
Then, which is so weird to me, is then Marty wants to put in this weird broken film strip image at the end of the film, and it's like the radio play at the end of Killers of the Flower Moon. It's like, I don't understand why you're doing that.
It's the
like, I really don't. It doesn't make sense to me.
He loves to end his films with weird shit, like the rat across the railing. Yeah, and so you're like, why are you doing this? Stop it. But I think I understand his logic here, because as the screeches and the sounds that are so disjointed come in, we also, near the end of that sequence, start to hear church bells.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a combination here to endure the pain in order to achieve glory. He kind of re-stresses the point by having that at the end, which I understand the logic, but I agree with you. I don't know if I 100% like it or it feels weird, but I understand the logic.
I wonder if it's a little bit of him going, hey, folks, just remember this is really a movie. It's just a movie.
Maybe.
You know,
kind of
it totally takes me out of the film. It really does.
That's true.
Yeah. So, by the way, this movie was very controversial.
No.
And I won't even go into how, but there was, boycotts, there was riots, there were theater bombings in France. Martin Scorsese had bodyguards for over a year due to death threats from this film.
Yeah.
It did have standing ovations sometimes. It had lots of controversy and protests other times. People hated the movie, people loved the movie. It literally never appeared on the shelves at Blockbuster. Yep. For the rest of Blockbuster's existence. Wow. One of our Patreon supporters, Adam McAllister, asked, do you think this movie could still have caused an outrage if it was released in 2024?
Yes. Especially nowadays with the division that's going on in our political landscape and how one side feels that they have co-opted God and co-opted religion to support their points of views, and are very adamant and loudly trying to bring about Christian nationalism onto our country and into the world. And I think this film would have been super controversial. You would have heard the same things that you heard back then. People would have been like, oh, see, these are the left-wing intellectuals trying to diminish God and insult God and all these things that are, of course, incorrect. It's an exploration. And I'll save it for my final thoughts, but I don't think this film is anti-religious or anti-God or anti-Jesus in any way, shape, or form. And in fact, I think it's pro those things, but people would twist it nowadays to fit their own personal agendas and narratives so they can get as many people to watch their programs or listen to their shows as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I'd go like, look, if the question is, are people likely to get outraged about religious topics in 2024? The answer is 100% yes.
Yes.
I think it would be just as controversial. I think it would hit in a different way and be controversial in a different way. Yep. I'm going to say a very quick anecdote, which is a long time ago, which relates to this. And maybe I'll cut this out, but a long time ago, I was listening to like a radio show and they had like 2 or 3 scientists and 2 or 3 religious figures talking about the world.
Mm-hmm.
And what struck me is that I assumed that The scientist guys would be the ones most like, this is absolutely 100% the truth. And the religious people would be softer. And it was, in fact, the opposite. That the science guys would go, well, we think this, but we don't know this, and we're not sure about this, and this could be this or could be this. We need to do more experimentations. And the religious people in this particular radio show were 100%, this is the truth. This is not the truth. This is how things work.
Yeah.
I think the attitude of knowing this is the truth is what leads to the controversy. And the being willing to explore different ideas is what protects you from the controversy.
Yeah.
You know,
I agree with that.
I always say what things were nominated for. The only nomination this received for an Academy Award was for Best Director, which it lost to Barry Levinson, who won for Rain Man that year. Not even my favorite Barry Levinson movie. But that doesn't mean I think that Scorsese should have won Best Director for this movie because, and this will maybe take us to our final thoughts, is that I will say something we said in the last part. I don't really think this is a great film. I think this is a fascinating film. And I think that the conversation that you and I have had is one of my favorites because the topic is so powerful and profound.
Yeah.
And where Scorsese doesn't necessarily succeed in my mind of making a cinematic masterpiece. I'm not moved and involved and taken away in the way that I am with what I would consider to be a great film. He does 100% succeed in making me think and challenging ideas and bringing up topics for me to discuss with you and to hear your thoughts and to which bring up more ideas. And that in a way, to me, is more connected to what I said earlier about the Talmud and the Jewish approach to religion, which is we don't know the truth. What we have is the opportunity to discuss things that are important. What makes life have meaning? What is it to be human on the earth? And so while as a piece of cinema, I don't think this is a great film, as a piece of religious thought, I think this is really powerful. That, I think, is my final thoughts on Last Temptation of Christ.
My final thoughts are, I agree with you. I don't think this is one of Scorsese's best, but I do think he accomplishes so much in getting us to question religion, to question our devotion and dedication to religion, and to explore the human point of view that is so essential in making religion connectable to so many of us. You know, there is this disconnect that we have where we see Jesus as the best of us, and therefore, what would Jesus do? All of that comes into play. But one of the things that gets lost, and I think one of the things that this film recaptures, is that he was a human being first and foremost, who accepted eventually his path and tried to spread God's word and sacrificed himself for our sins, and in the end was risen to reinforce the joy that can come from religious devotion, pure religious devotion, not religious devotion manipulated to judge others for their life, their lifestyle, or their beliefs. Because if you love God's children, you love all their children, you don't pick and choose which ones to love. And I think this is important when you look at this film, because I think this film is secretly very pro-religious, very pro-Jesus, and very pro-dedication to religious service, because the questioning of it, he questions, Jesus as the main character, questions his role in God's plan, as we must all do in our lives numerous times, for those of us who believe. Question our role in God's plans. He questions his role throughout the entire movie. He stumbles around, he fumbles around, he's not sure he's doing it right, but there are moments where he feels driven to put stakes in the ground, driven to have, when he puts the circle around and says, I'm not leaving till you come talk to me. There are moments of strength within this Jesus that you can forget because he has these moments of questioning. But in the way that this story is being told, Jesus is supposed to reflect all of us, and that all of us have our questions of faith. All of us have our faith questioned. All of us wonder if we're believing in the right way, or if it's really going to lead to anything. All of us have that. But by the end, what does he do? He accepts God fully. He accepts his place in the plan, and he accepts the sacrifice that he must have to do. So for all the questioning and the fantasy sequence and the dream sequence, whatever you want to call it, and all the struggles he has with Judas and with other people and the battles and the Pharisees and all the stuff with Mary Magdalene and Mary and all the things, at the end of the day, through all of it, he accepts his role in God's plan. He accepts that he must sacrifice, and he does it willingly and lovingly with a smile on his face because he knows he is saving the world. And so to me, at the end of the day, for all the questioning, it is a very pro-religious film, a very pro-Jesus Christ film because of the questioning, because the questioning makes his faith even stronger. And too many people want to be the little angel devil who doesn't want you to question things and confront God and explore and look backwards and do all of these things. Too many people want you to just accept it without questioning it. And that to me is where the danger lies. Questioning makes your faith stronger. Questioning does not make your faith weaker. So,
trying to think of how to say this, the part of the question, I think, is really about, well, what is the purpose of Christianity? So, and does this further that purpose or does it not? And I don't think people spend a lot of time asking that question.
Yeah.
What does God actually want? Are you a better Christian having watched this film or having not watched this film? You know, and I don't have an answer to that question. Obviously, as an atheist, I would not be capable of answering it, but it is one I'm going to think about after. And we would love to hear your thoughts. Obviously, John and I had a lot to say, and our conversations went far beyond this film, but it was inspired by this film. And we would love to hear your thoughts. If you want to visit us on our Facebook page, you just do a search for the Cine-Files. If you want to follow us on Twitter, it's Cine_Files, the Cine-Files podcast on Instagram. Of course, you can subscribe to the show if you haven't already at all the usual places, including Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you do subscribe there, we'd love to get your reviews. If you want to get ad-free versions of the show, plus all of our bonus episodes and shorts, you can subscribe to the subscription tier on Apple Podcasts or patreon.com/thecine-files, where we have a whole bunch of other tiers available as well. You can buy or stream The Last Temptation of Christ along with every other film we've ever reviewed on cinephiles.net. And you can follow me at SR Morris on Twitter and SR Morris1 on Instagram. John, how would people find you?
You can always find me at The Rocha Says on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, The Outlaw Nation on Twitch, my own YouTube channel, youtube.com/John Rocha Says, and my other podcasts that I have out there for you all to enjoy and subscribe to, The Geek Buddies and The Hot Mic.
And I think that is it for this week. That is it for The Last Temptation of Christ. That is it for the season of Scorsese. And we are going to move on to some very, very different films. We got some very exciting plans on the Cine-Files, and we can't wait to bring them to you starting next week, right here on the Cine-Files.